Welcome. This is our new setup. Not that we just changed some lights.
Just some lighting.
We got some things to work out. Still kind of really dark and shady back here. It's like they might creep up, but hopefully it's nothing. Yeah. Are you allergic to the lighting? Is that what's going on?
It's just really dark in here now. It's scary.
All right, guys. Well, welcome. My name is Gus.
I'm Chris.
And this is the Anomaly Podcast until we decide to call it something else. So if you have any ideas for a new name that we have yet to come up with, that's the name. So that's what we got. So we're just a bunch of the two guys and whoever else that we can figure out to get over here to talk about, like, religion, politics, metaphysics, whatever the case. We tried to do this before, but the mic wasn't working. So what I was saying before was that
I think say exactly how you said it before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I just think it's important to have these kind of conversations, right? People get all wrapped up into like all the negativity that's tied to this, but these are important conversations to have because this is how we either live our lives by or we're governed by. So like it seems like these would be important conversations to have.
Yeah.
So and I think a lot of people get tied up in the what's it called, the dichotomy of like good and bad and red and blue and whatever, good and evil and all that other good stuff. And things tend to be a lot more nuanced than that. And I think that's where discussion really makes a difference, because then we can actually have like a deeper conversation about, well, what do you mean by that, right? Mm-hmm. And then kind of try to find solutions through there. And as opposed to, hey, I'm gonna try to prove you wrong, right? And I think I see a lot of that. I don't know if you been watching like the there's been these videos that I've been seeing, and I've seen a number of different people. I think Ben Shapiro was in one of them, and Peterson,
Jordan
Peterson, where it's like them versus like 25 people that are like,
I saw the
juxtaposed to them.
Yeah, like one that hit, I didn't watch it, but there was what came across my YouTube feed was Candace Owens versus 20 feminists.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
So
what's the other guy's name? What's the tall, younger?
Charlie Kirk.
Charlie Kirk versus 20 woke.
Yeah.
Things like that.
That's just a setup for a fight.
Totally is.
And everyone has like seconds to talk. So like, how are you going to have like any kind of deep conversation, right? Because like the people that are coming in, they have a few minutes to kind of state their point, and most of them are coming in, well, I got a few minutes, I gotta show Charlie Kirk or Candace Owens or Ben Shapiro or whoever they're doing it with how wrong they are, and they're coming in with that, as opposed to like being able to have like a deeper conversation and nuanced conversation about how all of this can kind of play out. And some people are better at that than others, but I mean, it tends to be more adversarial than it is really a legitimate conversation.
I don't think that it's necessarily a fruitful way to have discourse like that. I think it's more for the benefit of whoever the channel is for. So if it's Charlie Kirk, right, it's really because he has the ability to kind of set, and whoever it is talking has that ability to really kind of set their position, and it's kind of like a let me prove you wrong kind of a thing. Because I mean, when you think about it, and I don't know if they're all completely different, because I would say the one that I watched was with Charlie Kirk, and the way that it is like you have as much floor time to discourse him as the people around you feel that you're having good discourse. Right.
But there's still minutes.
It still could be minutes.
Because they're also incentivized to make it short because they want their time.
Yes. And I also think that it doesn't. I think that it definitely skews the narrative towards whoever the host is, because like when you think about it, like in that sense, they're the professional of like whatever they want to talk about.
Yeah.
Right. And they've got they probably have better public speaking skills than the general people. Like they can, they're just better at the linguistics.
Yeah. They're better at debate and stuff like that. Yeah.
So they can really make whoever their discourse, really make them look more ignorant or less intelligible, like they don't know what they're talking about, just because of the way that they're able to articulate themselves, which kind of just reinforces this position without maybe really substantive facts, or positions. It's just kind of like
they're better at debate.
Like I can just make you look stupid,
and
even though because now I made you look stupid, your position is now I've just discredited your position.
Correct.
Regardless of how credible that position may be, or what you're bringing to the table.
I understand why, like, because you can get sound bites out of that. Right,
for sure.
You get sound bites out of that all day long.
You see the shorts all day long on that,
and I think that's the main people that people watch. And of course, you'll have some people that will be like, oh, Candace Owens got rocked on this one because of some sound bite, right? And then you don't hear the whole part of it, and then it looks like she got rocked, and then the next soundbite will be Candace Owens rocks this, whatever, and it's the same person saying like the immediate response or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like,
it would be great if you would get these. I'm going to call them public figures because they're public figures in a sense. It would be great to see some of these public figures like do debates against other public figures on the other side.
Which happens sometimes.
But not as much as like these click bite sound bites. Like what it would be great is like, if you're going to have a discourse, you're going to have a debate, like I think that Bill Maher does a good job with it. He's got something After Dark or something.
Yeah.
But he's got like random people on too, just like Joe Rogan.
Sure.
Those are more conversations.
Long form
conversations, not really like debate. But I think it would be cool to see more debate style where you're talking about specific things. I enjoyed debate when I was in school.
Have you seen the Oxford debates?
No, I have.
Those are pretty good. Those are pretty good
because you can find those on YouTube. I'm sure.
Yeah, they come on. You see them on YouTube, and they're pretty good. They're a little bit better structured. I mean, they're still one-sided. Sometimes that's not true. Sometimes they're like evenly keeled, but those are better because they're more long form. They kind of allow for like a more structured discourse, right?
Yeah,
which is nice. So that style of those conversations tend to be a much more interesting like form of conversation.
When I was in college, my fraternity that I was in, once I pledged and became a brother of the fraternity, I ended up taking the role of the vice president of membership, and so I was in charge of bringing in the new pledge class, and I was also in charge in creating the curriculum and what they were going to be doing and what they needed to accomplish throughout. And one of the things that they had is they typically had like 2 or 3 projects, and I had one project for them, and it was a debate. And I let them, if I remember correctly, I had a host of different things, a little bit not super heated, I guess, topics. I don't even remember what the topic they actually had, but topics of that would create a good discourse where there was like people had fairly strong opinions on it, and I let them pick through the masses on what we came to the topic, and then I had everybody, and it was just for me. So nobody, it wasn't. I told them, I was like, put the position that you agree most with, and then when they gave that to me, I put them on teams, and I had them argue the other side. So I had them argue against their position.
Steel man.
Yeah,
that's a steel man.
Is that what it is?
That's what that's called. So you heard the straw man argument?
Yeah.
So straw man argument is basically, you're kind of making the other side, you're weakening the other side's position by, and this is my understanding of it. I may be completely wrong. I'm pretty sure this is what it is. You're putting a false pretense as to the other side's argument so that you can make your argument really strong. Well, steel manning is where you get your argument and you look at if I were on the other side of this, how would I argue against my own position? Yeah. And then what that does is that it's called steel man because it helps to make the position like steel. Like, okay, if you can position yourself against it and you're not able to, then you've made a really strong case.
Yeah.
Right. So it makes it harder. It makes it better for you to kind of I guess better understand like the positioning that you have, which is a great way to kind of look at like any position that you might hold, regardless of what it is. To try to steel man it, like go on the other side of it.
Yeah,
how would you argue
and my purpose in having them do that was to open like I mean, my goal and the hope that I was like, the lesson that I was hoping to instill or help bring to the table was just, critical thinking from the other, because if you have to argue against the position that you have, then you're forced to research on the positions that don't jive with your position.
And you find gaps.
And then you can find gaps, right? Yeah. And maybe you don't find gaps, but I feel like that's just such an important way to see things. Because I'm a huge believer, and I tell my kids this all the time, like when they're like from their critical thinking, I was like, in my opinion, one of the fastest ways to prove something true is to try to disprove it. Right. So I guess I feel like I get that from like my earlier like studies in science and stuff, like the scientific process. Right? You form a postulate and then you hold a control group and then you try and disprove that theory. And by doing so, you either prove that position or it becomes disproven. So,
right.
But I think it's just like that all around.
I mean, this goes back to like what we were talking about, where I think there was a couple episodes ago we were talking about like how much information is out there. Like there's so much information, and it's become so overwhelming that it's just easier to just consume information and not really think through like what it is that you're consuming. And then there are, we know that they're like the way that the algorithms work, they're like designed to manipulate the way that you think about things. The way that you, right. And that if it's something is positioned in the appropriate way and because it appears to be factual, even if it's not, that your mind just says, oh, well, that's the truth. Right. And then now you get these sort of like, multivariable realities that people have, right? Different people have their truth, their reality, right? Which is not in sync with other people's reality. And I say that because, this idea of thinking through any position that you have, right, is not an active practice. Like we don't go through that. It's not taught in school, really. Right. It's not an active practice. And typically it's whatever you hear in some media form, and then you take sound bites from it because it makes you sound smart because they sounded smart. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to make that mine. And those are the words that I'm going to use. So people are just taking these sound bites of information and turning that into like, hey, this is the truth.
I think that's laziness and a lack of critical thinking. And I think that you would argue is like, because I know that you make the position too sometimes where it's like people just don't have the time to do these things. And
it's hard to call that lazy though, because if they don't truly have the time, it's hard. If they have to work 2 and 3 jobs,
I would call it lazy from the standpoint that if you're going to take those sound bites and then use them to reinforce your position off of a soundbite and assert that as truth or assert that as fact without doing the critical thinking and research on your own to support that, that's laziness.
So the better position in that scenario, just not have a position, right?
Not have a position, right? Like hey, I heard this, great. Well, this is what I heard too. It was just a soundbite, and like I feel like sometimes I'll say that too, even when we're having. Dude, like this is what I heard. I haven't done the research. I don't know really like to it. I mean, but I think it's all about how things are presented. Like, did you hear? I don't remember what committee RFK was speaking to, but they were talking to him about something. I think it was had to have been about vaccines or something. And they brought up the fact that like his team, they brought forth like where they cited these things from, and they weren't real links. They weren't real sources. It was like AI generated stuff. Like it was just like a broken source. Like, and so they had asked him, is like, how are you questioning the truthfulness of the position because of these sources? And then his response rebuttal back to that was the foundation of the premise is sound. So it's like, okay, but why if the foundation of the premise is sound, then why are you using not real sources as sources in the report? And we don't need to get into the detail. But my point to that is that information can be presented in such a way that it sounds factual,
right? Or appears to
be factual. And with that lack of time or just I only say that it's lazy as if you take stuff without doing the research and then you regurgitate it. And
that's fair. I think that's a fair position. Yeah. But I think your point is like he comes. It's like, oh, I have this bibliography of like this is where my sources are, and for a person to then say, oh, well, then let me research your bibliography of resources. Most people are not going to do that because you've cited a bibliography of resources.
Yeah,
you're going to assume, oh, okay, so this is what they've asserted. This is the information they're basing it off of. Okay, great. So it sounds like this would be good information.
Yeah.
It sounds like this would be accurate. You have resources that I can refer to if I need to, but I'm going to assume that you're giving me that information because I don't, just for reference, but I don't need to necessarily check to see if those are real references or if they're.
I didn't have to do that in grade school.
Right.
There's just real references. Yeah. But I think that stuff is. Stuff is interesting. I was actually watching because you talked about, the beginning, you're like, oh, we talk about metaphysics and stuff, and I'm not prepared to talk about metaphysics by any means. But you know who Neil deGrasse Tyson is?
Yeah.
So every now and then I'll watch his Star Talk podcast. Just I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
But I got hit with one a couple of nights ago, and it was interesting. He said this is a special podcast because it touched more on like politics, which is just not his
forte.
It's just not his realm.
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily speaking about politics on certain positions or anything. It was they had a lady on, and I don't know if she was the founder or if she was just like one of the high ups in the organization that's helping to get it off the ground. But they are I don't even call them a news organization. It's called Ground News.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with Ground News.
Yeah.
Have you seen the app? It's cool.
I haven't gotten a chance to check it out, but I was listening to it and I looked at the thing, but I was like, you know what? That's such a great resource. And what they were saying was like you still have to have the subscriptions to the different places, but to the point where we were talking, I think I mentioned this last week did I bring up the Dr. Phil thing last week?
I don't remember. That doesn't sound familiar.
So my wife was shared a video of Dr. Phil, and it was high level. It was pretty much him talking about the reasons why the Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party.
Yeah, this sounds familiar.
Right, and then just listed off all of these reasons as to what's wrong with the Democratic Party and all of this stuff. And some of the stuff I agree with. It's it's stuff that I feel is just there, and some of the stuff I just thought was bogus. I just thought it was ridiculous. But the point was, what I took away is like, you know what? But they position that as though the right doesn't have the same problems on different issues or different, but doesn't have the same
type of issues.
Issues, right? And so the people who are watching this video are going to be more of those right-leaning people, right? And that's just reinforcing that position.
They're in their silo.
Yeah, and then you're going to have somebody who's on the left who's going to do the same thing in a sense, highlighting the issues and the problems of the Republican Party.
Right.
While also not addressing the issues within their own party, on the other side of the aisle. And it's like, what I think is really cool about this one is that they give that headline and then they list down all of the different news sources or media outlets that have headlines or articles on those things. And then they've got like their rating system. One's crowdsourced, another one is from I think a third party rating, and then I forget what they said that the third one.
You talking about Ground News does? You're talking about that's the app is really good. So it gives political leanings and stuff like that, which is great.
Yes, based on those statistical averages, but then also based on their past articles and stuff that they have posted, gives a credibility ranking.
Right.
And they don't push a position, and they don't journal on a position topic. But a statistic that I thought was really cool that she had shared was that, like, somebody will come in and they'll get their news sources from like 2 or 3 sources from whatever hub they typically are coming from, whether Democratic or Republican in this sense. And she said, but what we see is that over the course of the next 2 or 3 months for active users, those average source clicks for things turn into like 10 or 12. And they didn't delve into whether or not that's 10 or 12 still within the bubble lean or not. But I just think that's it, because the fact is, even if they haven't gotten there, right, and they're not, I would assume that a good number of them are probably absorbing more stuff outside of their bubble. But even if they're not, the fact that, I think it's a win, the fact that somebody is even looking at more than 2 or 3 sources to garner an opinion or garner their information, I think is really important. And I just thought that was, I was like, that's just, I feel like, I hope that we can get that. I hope that becomes more
commonplace,
because I just think that, everybody's talking about, you don't want somebody telling you the position or stuff, but there's no real place for you to get unbiased.
But that doesn't exist though.
Like news.
But unbiased news doesn't exist.
Well, I don't mean unbiased news. I mean just where you can see everything from all different outlets.
Right. I mean, I think the thing that you have to...
You still have to use your critical thinking skills to determine where biases or truths lie within those outlets, I feel.
I think what ground news does is it at least illuminates where the likelihood of bias may exist. Excuse me, so that you can, at least when you're reading it, the likelihood of bias is that it may be conservative or it may be liberal, right? And so now I'm reading with those glasses, knowing that there's a bias to that side. So because I have that additional knowledge, that context, it allows me to understand, like, okay, how do I need to be paying attention to this? Because then also, when I know that context is there, I can also say, well, I wonder what the liberal view on this is.
What's interesting is that she also mentioned, which I didn't even think of it this way. She's like, do you know, based on what her assertion was, do you know where the majority of the bias comes from between the outlets? From the lack of coverage.
Interesting.
So it's not
when they exclude stuff.
It's the exclusion of
news stories.
Interesting. That creates the separation of biases, not necessarily the different positions on the stories. Gotcha. It's that they just this outlet just doesn't cover it,
right?
And they'll cover something that's
more in line with
their base, and same thing over here. And I'm like, so I was like, wow, that's really, so maybe as people start seeing that, and maybe you sound like you've known about this a little bit more, so maybe you've used the app more, but I mean, as you're looking through it now, I'm curious to see what you like. Do you see the fact that, like, these headlines from more conservatives, is there just a real big separation of what's being headlined between the two?
There is a little bit of separation, and it's usually subtle stuff. But it's interesting because a lot of the news stories that come out, like, they headline it with the intention of, like, that is the likelihood that most people are just going to read the headline.
Yes,
that's their news.
That is the news.
They read the headline. Oh, now I know, right? Yeah, you know what I mean. Like, that's how they go about it. So then that's their. That's so the headline usually, if you read headlines.
I look at Zillow, I can sell my house.
Yes. So, but it's even worse than that, because it's like, it at least, Zillow, you may actually stay some time looking at it for some time, looking at houses over and over again, right?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So versus a headline where you might not investigate at all. You'll just see the headline.
A lot of headlines are they're misleading.
Yes.
They're very misleading. When you read the article, you realize how that headline relates to the article,
right?
But the position that you might take, or the information you take from the headline versus what the article is about, I feel like 8-9 times out of 10 is
also
not the same thing.
A lot of times it also the headline itself provides, like, there's an infusion of bias that's built into the headline. So, like, for example, the language that they use for the headline, like, so, like, if there is a I don't know, I'm trying to think of a headline I can't remember one, but they'll use language where, two people were the debate between A and B, right? And then the headline might be, A argues with B, blah, 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 right? And then the difference between they had a civil debate between A argues against B, blah, 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 makes it, now it's positioning one against the other, as opposed to, hey, there was this debate that happened. This is the article about that debate for you to determine like your interpretation of it. So they will like lean, the headline will lean into whatever angle they're trying to go after. Yeah. Which is, and you know what's interesting? I was actually my wife is she doesn't do a lot of social media, so she really doesn't get influenced a lot. And I feel like I'm a pretty learned person and I try to pay attention to stuff, but I get caught in this all the time where I'll see stuff and I'll be reading different news articles and stuff like that, and then I'm much better at it now, where I will have sort of an assumption of things that are happening, right? Because I've seen it so many times from this side, from that side, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm trying to do as much information gathering as I can online as much as possible, which, you only have, there's only so much you can do. And she came back and she said once to me, well, and I think at the time I was talking about some issue that was happening between the left and the right somewhere, and it didn't matter what the issue is, but it was something like that. It was an issue, and it was supposedly there was this sort of a lot of aggression happening between the two sides. And she asked me, she's like, well, are you seeing that like in your day to day? And I thought for a second, and I was like, you know what? I'm not seeing that in my day to day. Like all of the vitriol and all of the aggression and the hate that's happening online and all that stuff, like I wasn't seeing it in my day to day. She's like, well, how do you know that's really happening? Like they're making it seem like it's happening everywhere. I mean, have you talked to anyone where they're experiencing that? And I didn't, and I started asking more people the same question. I'm like, hey, are you seeing that like in your day to day? Do you see that? Mm-hmm. And everyone's saying the same thing. Well, no. I mean, sometimes you might get, well, this one guy or this one girl. I'm like, yeah, but besides that one person, like in the rest of your life, are you seeing any of that? Mm-hmm. And it got me thinking, and we talk about this. It just got us thinking about like how much manipulation is happening in what is being shared and to what end, right? Like there's this conversation that's happening about how as an example, politically, the left and right are just at odds with each other, and liberals can't get along with conservatives, and there's just this hate that happens. But I have a ton of liberal friends and a ton of conservative friends, and they don't hate me and they don't seem to hate each other. Mm-hmm. They're just normal Americans, mm-hmm. right? But if you look at the news media, and it almost doesn't matter where you look, there's just sort of like they're the enemy, and there's just sort of this fight that has to happen in order to for some end. I don't know, right? And one of the things that she was actually reading, I want to say it was an article that she read, or maybe it was a book, I can't remember, where, a lot of the stuff that you see in politics or that you see that's being pushed is for the purpose of being able to have a reason to change the laws so that our rights can slowly be removed for the purpose of safety and security and for the kids and all that other stuff, right? Where the gun debate is one that's a really big one that people have, right? The whole Second Amendment and blah, blah, blah. And should people have guns or should people pick up guns and whatever? And, I think how guns should be handled. I mean, there's a conversation to be had there, right? Like whether background checks and how much background checks and should they be checked with the blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, the reason why the Second Amendment was created was so that, if tyranny were to present itself, we as a people have the ability to be able to fight against it. And people, there's all kinds of arguments about, well, you're going to fight tanks. I'm like, I mean, you do with what you have, right? But you at least have a way to fight against it. And you can have a conversation about how that can be played out, but this whole idea of like, how it's presented, where you have this it almost sounds like a debate between people who want guns at like with no rules and people who want no guns, no matter the case. And like, I feel like those people exist, but they're at the fringes. But they're making it seem like,
I would say, I feel like the right tries to make it sound like the left is trying to take away your guns, but if you like get through all the bullshit, you realize the majority of the left is just pushing for common sense.
Well, again, and what
their common, right?
What they feel is
common sense.
But I mean, it goes on both sides though, because you see the left also making it seem like the right wants guns with like Wild Wild West, no rules.
You want to know what I was saying? I just listened to this today. You want to know what was one of the things that were that was in the big beautiful bill?
What's that?
Removing paying taxes on silencers.
Oh, yeah.
Which I just thought was interesting.
That is interesting.
Like, why? First of all, who the fuck needs a silencer?
Well, okay.
It's kind of my thing. Like, well, I mean, I know who needs a silencer.
Right.
But you can also get a potato.
Yes.
So, and then what's the purpose of not paying taxes?
Well, I mean, who does that really impact? Like, is there like a huge market for silencers that like paying taxes on silencers is like detrimental to people's survival? That's a weird tax to remove.
It's just a weird...
It's a weird thing to not tax.
It's a weird thing to not tax. So, like, when I see it, my thing is like, why? Like, it's not like whether or not it's taxed or not, but it's like,
so
why was that important to be in there?
That's
like,
so
what's
specific.
the stuff that's going on in the background?
So specific.
And
that's
then,
funny.
We talk about things like, because I don't think you have to have like a special license, I think, to get a silencer. Like, you can't just go buy a silencer.
Right.
Like, I think you need to. And then I think it's
the same thing with automatic weapons. You can't just buy an automatic weapon.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. You have these people who yell about, when you talk about, we can discourse what we consider common sense gun laws or restrictions and stuff. But, you hear the people, and it could just be that narrative throwing, but it's like, the Second Amendment is that our rights shall not be infringed. I was like, but they are already being infringed, because you can't have a desert, you can't have a 50 caliber sniper rifle, you can't have a rocket launcher, you can't have half of the military grade weapons, even if they were available to the public. Like, you legally can't have those things. Like, I don't even think you could have a grenade.
I think you can, but you need I want to say that you are able to get some of that stuff.
But you need what?
You need some kind of special licensing or something for it.
So that right there in of itself, to my position, is, how is that not an infringement?
Well, it would categorically be an infringement. I mean,
right.
So here's the argument, and I know this is not supposed to be a Second Amendment debate session, but
yeah, we didn't even get the first one.
The argument, I think the argument is that if you have to register all of your weapons, right?
And the government knows who has the weapons, how many weapons they have,
correct,
yada yada.
Correct.
So I would say, I don't know if I'm. So this is something that's going around too, right? Did you hear about the administration is pushing for a citizenship registry database?
I've heard about this. Yes.
I'm not really for that myself. I think a lot of states aren't either. But I don't think that should be something on the federal. I think that, because I understand the problem with people's concerns about the federal government having too much information on them. I think that's a fair concern, because it's not a concern until it becomes a concern, and then it is too late, right? But I don't think that it is. I think that a decent compromise would be is like, hey, if we need to have some checks and balances on it, well then it should be, maybe the requirement is that it happens on a state level, right? Because your state might have that information, and they're not required to share that with the federal.
But what would be included in as part of that, as an example? Let's say for a citizen registry, what would be, what are they trying to argue for? Like, do you know what they're
to ensure that illegals and people who aren't supposed to vote, to prevent voter fraud.
But why wouldn't just a license do that?
Well, so my understanding is that there's not one, because licenses could be that information could be out of date, is what I've, based on the thing that I was listening to, is that it doesn't necessarily, like, you could show the license, but that license doesn't, how long is your license good for? Your license is good for 10 years. Yeah. What happens if you got that license? And I don't know how all the semantics work, but what happens if you had some form of citizenship at that point that you got that license or a visa, and now you don't have it, or whatever that can be?
I feel like it's such an exception to the rule.
So that, I think, is the argument. So there's two arguments. The argument is one, that there's, not that much voter fraud. Like,
well,
that's one argument. That could be debated.
Well, I'm saying as it relates to what you're talking about, where someone who has an outdated license,
that's what
that has to be the minority of a minority.
I understand that the states use a bunch of different. There's not like one database that the state goes to determine citizenship or voter, not citizenship, but to determine voter eligibility. They try and like cross-reference it, from my understanding, from a bunch of, from like the DMV to like, and so it's not easy or efficient, right? Which is part of the reason why the whole thing is,
like, they want to try to make like technology to
to do so. And I get it. Like, I mean, I don't think that should be on the federal. If we're talking about it, I don't think it should be a federal registry, because the way that people vote is a state thing. The state controls
voting
for their state. So why does the federal government need to have a registry?
That is a appropriate position.
They don't need a registry.
Right.
I can get on board with discussions around having
because we don't really vote for the president. We vote
for our electors, who then vote for the president and cast the vote based on how the state has dictated.
Correct. Yeah.
So I can see that being, if you want to put like something into, I don't know if it necessarily be law or something. If you want to put something in the law that requires states to have a centralized registry of for voter eligibility for the states to handle, I can see.
You can make a case for that.
I can make a case for that. But to require it to be on the federal level, or for the states even to require the states to share that information with the federal government, I don't think is appropriate. Just like, if you want to talk about whatever, back to the Second Amendment, if you want to talk about like gun restrictions or registries or something like that, the concern is that you don't want to give that to the federal government because of that. I think that, maybe that happens on the state level in some capacity, wherever those things happen. Because I am big on having state power, right? And I think that there's certain things that need to be on the federal level to keep, what do you want to call it? Consistency is not the right word. Consistency is not the word, but to where it's just like, it makes sense for it to be kind of like an all-encompassing thing.
Like continuity across all states.
Yeah, continuity. Yes, there's certain things that, and so that's the question. It's like, is it necessary to have that continuity across all of the states for purposes of whatever? That's a federal thing. But if it's like not necessary.
So, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. And not that I'm necessarily taking this position, but I'm just trying to think here. I'm trying to think through this. So let's say, for example, the federal government right now, they're enforcing through like immigration law, right? They're trying to enforce immigration, right? And they're going into states where they feel there is, like, utilizing ICE and stuff like that, where they feel there are a high level of immigrants that are illegal immigrants that potentially have like criminal backgrounds or whatever the case may be. Apparently, there have been a few cases of people who don't have criminal backgrounds that have been picked up. But generally speaking, my understanding is their focus is on people who have some kind of criminal history. So if they don't have a registry to know who's a citizen versus who's not a citizen, and the state is unwilling to participate with them, how would they enforce that law? How would they enforce immigration law for someone who's illegal that needs to be deported?
So I don't know how
because California is not deporting people. They're a sanctuary. They have sanctuary cities in California, right?
Yeah.
As a state, they really are just like, oh, come on in,
yeah.
right? But that causes a problem because this goes back to how the electorate works, right? Is the seats that they have in the House of Representatives is based on their population, regardless of whether or not the people in the census are legal or illegal, right? It's just whatever the population is, and the more the higher their population, the more seats in the House that they have, the more power,
the more power they have in Congress.
California has in Congress. So, which is obviously problematic because that's not really a fair way to have a count of people, unless you were to say, well, the census is only counting like either residents, like legal people who are here legally.
Yeah.
Right. Like that would be the only way that you can do that. Right. That they only count people who are here legally, but that's probably a logistical nightmare to try to get that. Right. Because usually what they do is they knock on doors, how many people live in the house. Right. If they also had to verify like each person's like whether they're here legally or not legally, like that would be just, I think, probably very challenging for census to do.
I guess I don't understand how and it's based on the pop. So like my children are considered part of the population that add towards the numbers of people of representatives we get in the House.
I believe it's just based on raw population. I don't think age is a factor. It's just raw population, and so they don't take into consideration age or immigration status.
So I would argue the fact that it's like if the consensus people are going and they're just taking numbers, they're asking how many people are in the home, then I would say that it is a moot point on whether or not the people there are legal or illegal. Because if it's as easy as them just taking that number there, what's to say that they just don't make up a number to add to the population? Like if you got rid of and we're going to do a simple example, right? Let's say that there was,
I mean, it requires, consensus workers, census workers, you got me saying, census,
Score.
Yeah. Census workers, I mean, they get paid nominally for doing that work. I mean, you'd have to get them to conspire, like, it's too much of a, like it would be too much of a logistical challenge to be like, oh, we're going to hire a bunch of people. And then, all right, now that you're sitting here, I want you to lie to the federal government and just say that this many people live here. Like it's too much of
So you're saying the census people, they just go and knock on doors. And if they answer, how many people do you live here?
Correct.
I mean, I would argue that, that may have worked in fucking the 1900s. And like, maybe we should just relook at how we take census.
Agree.
But I think that that's also...
But how do you do? I guess my point is that
I think that's in the Constitution, though.
Well,
how you do it,
I don't know. We'd have to look at that. I'm not certain about that.
I started reading the Constitution.
Yeah. But the challenge is that if I think it would be too much of it would be challenging to have that many people conspire because that becomes a problem.
Yeah,
people would find out, right? You can't keep a secret like that, right? Especially with people that they're not getting paid a ton of money to do this, right? They're getting paid probably minimum wage or something slightly above minimum wage to go out and take numbers. So it's not like they're gonna keep that secret. So that's gonna get out, and that's gonna become a problem, and then that's gonna be a whole other issue. So I think that yes, that probably needs to be reassessed. I do feel like if they're gonna count people, that they have to do one of two things. Either the census needs to validate that the people are here legally, right? Or you'd have to enforce illegal immigration.
I just don't understand why it's so difficult. Like, it's like on one end, it's like, okay, so you don't know who is here legally or illegally, right? So you got to get rid of the illegals in order to know who here's legally so that all of the other numbers and stuff are more accurate. Right. But I would argue if it's just as easy to determine the illegals to get them deported, why isn't it just as easy for the states to determine their legal citizens and then take census off of them?
I mean, that would probably be kind of what you're talking about, but at the state level. So that's what Trump is talking about at the federal level, but to have the states do it at the state level. But
you're saying taking what he's doing at the state, you're moving what he's doing into the state level, like I was saying.
Yes, yeah. That's essentially what you'd be doing. But then, the question is are like the states would still have to participate, and they're incentivized based on how the power of the House works. They're incentivized to count as many people as possible, because the more people they have, the more seats they have in the House.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they're incentivized to not do exactly what you're talking about. You see what I'm saying? So, if we found out, and I don't know what the numbers are, but if we found out, for example, California had, 15% of their population was not legal citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say, for example, I mean, they'd lose some seats in the House, and those seats, where would those seats go? Percentage-wise, they'd go probably back to red states.
What do you mean percent? Well, those seats would just not be in the House anymore.
No, seats don't ever disappear. They just get reallocated. Because based on the percentage of population per state, that's how the seats are reallocated. It's not like they add more seats.
Oh.
They reallocate based on the percentage of the population.
How many seats are there in the House? 200, 400 and something?
I don't remember the exact number. I think 462 or something.
Yeah, I was going to say 435 something, right?
Oh, maybe that's right.
So it's 435. So it would get reallocated based on
the percentage of population in that state.
Yeah, but I don't even remember. Let's just say that if this is wrong, I think California has like 60 something votes. 60 something. Let's say they had 60, and let's say they lost 10% of their population. That means they lose 6 seats.
Correct.
And it gets, how are you saying it gets reallocated?
Based on a percentage of the population overall between each state.
Oh.
So each state has a percentage of the population.
Yeah.
And then the seats are allocated based on the percentage that each state holds.
Oh, I get what you're saying. Mm.
So it's not like the number of seats changes.
Yeah.
Right?
It's just who gets the seats.
Who gets the seats. So they get reallocated because now the California would have a smaller percentage of people compared to the rest of the country, compared to other states that are surrounding them. Now, it's not going to go one for one, because if they lose 10% of their population, that's not 10% of the whole population, right? It's going to be...
Right, and then I'm just trying to think, and I'm not, but I'm like, well, what do we have? We have 22 seats in Florida, and our population has grown quite a bit, but I don't recall, and it just could be because I'm just not focused, but I don't recall, when have we gotten more electoral votes because of our population growth?
That's a good question. I think that happens every 10 years during the census.
Oh, okay, maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
We just had the census, did we not? A few years ago, I thought.
It happens on the
centennial.
20th. Yeah. It happens on the 20th, 30th, for the 40th.
Okay, so we'll have another one here in 3.5 years. 4 years.
Yes, in 4 years.
4 years.
So we're halfway between.
Yeah, man. I don't know. I don't. We have these conversations, and you realize that there's not really a black and white answer.
There's not
to it.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, right? Because everyone wants to have a black and white conversation, and that's not how a lot of the stuff kind of works out. It's way more nuanced, and you have to be willing to get familiar with what the nuances are, and then you have to come to terms with, okay, well, what is acceptable to me in the position that I have. For using immigration as an example, to just flat out say we need to get rid of all immigrants out of the country, illegal immigrants out of the country. Yeah, I in principle that sounds interesting in principle, and I can see why you might take that position. The logistical, the logistical nightmare that is, has to be astronomical. Do you realize we're talking about millions and millions of people?
Yeah.
Right? And then you got to get a department within the federal government of maybe let's say thousands of people, of people, to try to find millions and millions of people. And then you got to like identify them. Like you first got to find them, and then you got to get to them, and then you got to pick them up, and then you got to figure out you support them. And then we get into this sort of gray area of whether they're entitled to like a habeas corpus or not. You know, they're illegal and they came in illegally, so they really should be just deported, but they've been here for such a long time. So, you know, there's, you see what I'm saying? Like you start getting into this kind of weird gray area. I mean, technically they should just be out, but they've created a life here. They have kids here.
Yeah, but when I was reading the Constitution says that all persons have habeas corpus.
Mm-hmm.
So like it doesn't
specify.
It doesn't specify, which I think is interesting too. It's like, you know, there's that argument on birthright citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument by some is that was there for slaves to protect, like, so that when slaves were born or people coming out of slavery, when they were born, they got citizenship because they were born. It wasn't for illegal immigrants and stuff coming over the borders, having babies, and now they get citizenship.
Right.
So that's like from my understanding, it's one of the pillars in which they're trying to position that. But I go back to the fact that that's not what it says.
Right.
In the Constitution. It says that any person born in the country is a citizen and has all the rights there within. Right. So it's like, it doesn't really matter if you think that this was for this particular reason or set of people.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say that. Just like you can't take, in my opinion, is that you can't take that position that this wasn't for illegal immigrants who were coming across the border having babies. They shouldn't be granted citizenship because that's not the purpose of why it was written. But that's not what it says. Because then I would go and say, well, you know, the Second Amendment also says that you have a right to bear arms that's not infringed. And then I could argue that they actually meant like muskets and like single shots and like the type of weaponry that they had back then. That wasn't written for today, but that's not what it says. Like, so I feel like we go
when it's convenient,
yeah. Right? It's like, you got to take it's either literal across the board or it's not literal.
It's interpretive
across. And then I'm just like, which kind of leads me, I'm kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts on the Supreme Court's ruling? Was it Friday last week? They ruled that lower courts cannot, it's not called blanket immunity, but they cannot.
Oh, right. They can't.
It was on the immigration thing, right? But they can't enforce that across the nation.
For like executive.
Specifically this one he's wanting to do. Is it the birthright?
Executive orders
against birthright citizenship and stuff. But like, what was interesting was the council. I guess it's the council for the Trump administration. I guess that's who was representing. They didn't bring the case to the Supreme Court. The case wasn't about birthright citizenship. The case that was brought to the Supreme Court was whether or not the lower courts had the power to prevent a nationwide, I can't think of the word, movement from like an executive order.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court ruled, I think Coney Barrett was the one who gave the
ruling.
She wrote the ruling
mm-hmm.
for the it was divided on party lines. But they ruled that the lower courts do not have that right to do that. And I'm just kind of curious. I'm curious if you even have any thoughts.
I haven't read it. I'd have to read the ruling to see like how they got to that, because this is one of those things where you really have to understand what their thought process is, because a lot of people will jump to conclusions as to like, oh well, clearly that was a conservative move, or clearly that was a liberal move, or whatever the case may be. But a lot of these judges, whether they're conservative or liberal, they usually are very thoughtful about the way that they come to some decision, right? You don't get to be the Supreme Court justice and not be a thoughtful person. You may have your leanings or your biases, but they typically have thought through a lot of this stuff, and they have their they've come to whatever conclusion they've come to with with some thought put behind it. So I would want to read.
First, from my understanding, what she wrote was like, so this, whatever it's called, I'm going to call it a blanket rulings. That's not what it's called, but I think you understand the premise. She said that like this wasn't a thing up until, was it like the early 2000s or like the late 90s or something is when these things started happening. Before you didn't see this type of ruling from lower courts. And pretty much like, so because of that, like that was not a power that was vested in lower courts to be able to make. And I'd have to, I guess do some more or just research just like in the law and how things are. But like when I think about it, I'm like, I feel like it's part, like the judicial system is part of the checks and balances.
Yeah.
Right. So if an administration, I'm not going to use Trump because it has nothing to do with his administration. It just has to do with any administration. If an administration takes an executive order or does something without legislation being passed, and there's constitutionality or legal arguments to whether or not that administration could do that, like there's already a docket of cases that the Supreme Court has that it's having to work through and or chooses whether or not it wants to hear. And with everything, like I feel like, and this could just be my misunderstanding of how the judicial system is broken up, but like I see like the Supreme Court, and I'm going to use our industry as an example. I see the Supreme Court being like our broker. Yeah. Right. And then us as agents have agency with that broker, and we do our thing. Just like I would in my mind, the regional or the appellate or just the other Supreme Courts in the land,
state
levels, I would assume are like agencies of the Supreme Court. And so like in my thought, it's like, well, if somebody in a certain area feels that it is arguable, and then a judge, whether conservative, liberal, or whoever it is, makes a ruling one way or another to stay that executive order, not let it move forward, then the legal course of action is for them to appeal, and then it go to the Supreme Court, like just like it went to the Supreme Court here, right?
But the appeal, I think the problem is that, so in this case, the attorney was savvy in not appealing the ruling, but whether or not the judge had the power to rule at that level. Yes. Right. So I don't know what the sort of the legal process is for something like that.
Yeah. That's not my.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that, and with regard to what they brought to the court, they may have been correct in, that there may be constitutional limitations to what a lower court can do as it relates to what the executive branch can do as it relates to what that particular situation. So they may have an argument to say, hey, listen, unfortunately, there's a technicality that prevents you from being able to do this thing that you're trying to do.
Right? I've got to keep reading I didn't get to the judicial part.
So the question then becomes, to your point, is, okay, so let's say a lower court does do this thing. Does the lower court have any ability to be able to push this thing that they have, say, hey, listen, we think this is wrong, but we don't have the power to enforce it. We would like the Supreme Court to review this thing because you have the power to enforce this because you are the Supreme Court. Is there a way to do that where like they say, hey, this is a problem. We see this as a problem. We think there is a legal justification for like putting an all stop to this action because we feel that there is a legal problem with this thing. And we don't have the authority to enforce this thing because of the technicality or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Right? Can we push this to the Supreme Court to be like, we need you to use your enforceability power as the Supreme Court to do this thing that we think is illegal? Like, I don't know if that exists because that seems like that would make sense. Like if I'm a lower court and I see that there's a problem here that clearly this is crossing the lines for us, I want to send it to the Supreme Court to be like, hey, Supreme Court, is this something that needs to be enforced? Because I don't have the power to do this, but in my state, this looks like it's crossing the line. And then the Supreme Court can then review that and then make a determination as to, yeah, you know what, you're right. Or no, you can enforce it in your state, but this would not necessarily apply to everyone else. Or, you can enforce it in your state and you can push it towards other states to have their state level people enforce it, whatever the case may be, right? So you can do stuff like that. I mean, I don't know if you can do this.
You were just talking through.
Yeah, I mean, like that seems to me like a way that would make sense to me. Like, I don't know if that's their process, but like, I can totally see that being a logistical way to get through some of those challenges.
So for this particular one, from my understanding, is that like this creates it to where like because judges cannot make those rulings across because. From my understanding, you don't just go to the Supreme Court. Like typically the Supreme Court, you've got to go to the lower courts and it has to be appealed up to the Supreme Court.
That's on purpose. You don't want everything going to the Supreme Court.
Well, that's another reason why I'm like, okay, well, when we're talking about in today's day and age, we're talking about like this blanket rulings or whatever it is, like, and barring the technicalities and the legalities, right, that they may have ruled on. I'm just like, to me, that doesn't make sense because you can't, if something like this is happening, because I would use this as a very important piece, like he's trying to, their administration is trying to do away with birthright citizenship in some capacity for certain peoples, right? And that has major impacts. But if the administration kind of doesn't have a check on this right now, because they can continue to move forward with this until this case gets brought back up to the Supreme Court, if it even gets there. But I think Coney Barrett made mention, it's like this is stuff that is handled through like class action suits and by individual suits. So some individual, like if I feel that like my birthright citizenship is being taken away, I have the right to sue and I can pursue legal course of action. And then the challenge and argument to that is that legal suits are very fucking expensive, and the majority of people can't afford.
They're not only very expensive, but they're also, if you think about who is the most likely to be impacted,
people who can't afford it.
Well,
I would think
not only people that can't afford it, but it's going to be the parents of the kids that will be impacted, who are probably illegal themselves.
But their kids
would theoretically be legal because they were born here, right? So let's say that rule, because I don't know if it's going to be retroactive, for example. But let's say it starts today.
Yeah.
Right. And then we are illegal, and then we have a kid tomorrow. And our thought was when we had our kid, when we were in the midst of everything, that when this child is born, they're going to be citizens of the United States, and they won't have to worry about anything. We may still have to worry, but they won't have to, right? So now that status is gone.
Yeah.
So now I can't put in a suit. If I'm illegal, what am I going to do? I mean, I guess I could try, but now, like, anyone can come in and be like, well, that person's illegal, so I'm going to put a lawsuit against their illegality, and that'll probably supersede my lawsuit to try to make my child legal.
See, and I get it too. Like I said, it's just I only heard a couple of things just for news on this. And I get it. Like, I don't think that it's great. I think there's going to be a lot of issues, but I also appreciate the fact that, like, if the ruling was made soundly, right, then, I mean, it's kind of like where it's like, that is what, like, you can't bend or not do something because it may negatively impact some people if it's like clearly against what is stated in the Constitution. Or in this particular position, the Supreme Court has the power to interpret. It's literally what their fucking job is.
Yeah.
So, you can be mad at their interpretation, and then you can, be mad at, then you can go back to the politics of it all and get pissed at the party who put them in or whatever it is. But it's like, comes a point where it's like, their job is to interpret these things. So it's like, and what I also find interesting, and I like I said, I didn't get to I stopped at Article 3 because I got my kids to sleep and I could go to sleep myself. So I didn't read the judicial. But what I did find interesting is that if you look, in the Constitution, you got the preamble, and then Article 1 is about the legislative branch. And it's pretty lengthy, and it's pretty it's pretty written out what the powers and role and how things work in the legislative branch is. Like I think it's a good, like, at least 3 pages of like print, right? You go to the executive branch, which is Article 2, and it's pretty vague,
very interpretive,
and not very long.
Yeah.
Like, it is a very, like, comparatively to the other 2 branches, it's very short. So I just find it very interesting. I think it's interesting that, like, this particular administration that's pushing it seems to be getting a lot of executive power.
I mean, that's been happening over the last few decades.
That has, yeah, it definitely has. And I don't know, when I read the Constitution, and when you read, and like whenever you read it, I'd be curious what yours, but to me, in my opinion, the way that the framers wrote the Constitution was with the intent that the legislative branch would be, of the 3, the most powerful branch, because that is the branch of the people.
Yeah.
Right? The executive branch is not the branch of the people, but the other 2 are the checks and balances. Like, neither one branch should be more powerful than the other, but like when you read through, like, just in my interpretation when I'm reading it, as I'm reading through it, to me, it is clear that the expectation was that if any power was to be held greater than any other branch, it would be within the legislative branch, because that is the branch that is comprised of the individual states,
right?
That is comprised of the constituencies,
right? It's held accountable.
So
that people.
Yeah, exactly. They in and of itself has checks and balances within that particular one.
Yeah.
There's no checks and balances in the executive branch.
Right.
There's no checks and balances. There's no checks and balances in the judicial branch, even though one would argue, like, I don't really know. I feel like the judicial branch, the checks and balances is least impacted in the judicial branch, because I don't really know what they would need to be checked and balanced on.
Well, they don't. Remember, they don't.
You know what I mean?
They don't.
So they just interpret the law.
Yeah, they don't write
law.
Right, that's what the legislation does.
Yeah, they don't write law. They don't enforce law. They interpret the law. The judicial system interprets the law. The executive branch enforces the law, and the legislative branch writes the law. So, which again is also, I think that's a conundrum, right? Because, like, what if the Supreme Court ruled, in fact, that the lower courts had that right and they could stay that order or whatever, and then the administration, because they have some pretty significant support right now, we're just using this as the example, they got some pretty significant support in the legislative branch from the constituency on immigration and getting people out and doing this stuff, right? And they control the House. So it's like, what if the administration just starts like, oh, we don't give a shit? when you say we have a mandate from the people to do this, and they went and do it, they're the branch that enforces the law. But if they're the branch that's controlling the enforcement against the rulings of the judicial, how do you check that?
Well, that's the reason why the executive branch is not a permanent position, right? So like as soon as the president leaves the presidency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they did something that was illegal, the legislative branch could now pursue charges against that person, and that person could go to jail.
I don't think that you could do that now, because that was with it now based on the Supreme Court ruling from last year. Like it's got pretty decent blanket immunity on the president. He was acting in the capacity of the presidency, like, which is a reason why Trump wasn't able to be sued and stuff for a lot of, I think specifically one of the big things was like for the insurrection that was said. It was like, they can't charge him for inciting a riot or doing things because he was acting within his capacity as the president. So like, if that would be the legal argument, he was doing that, and the only way he could do that and move forward with that is through him acting in the capacity of the president, because it was through that capacity that he was able to give those orders and make movement on that. So then how would you charge?
Give what orders?
I guess I'm getting mixed up. The citizenship, like not granting citizenship to people who, in your example, right? It's like, I'm illegal, my wife's illegal. They're saying they're not granting citizenship to people who were born here who are illegal from that. So my child doesn't have citizenship, and this goes for a bunch of people, and then he leaves office. You can't sue him for. How can you sue him for doing something
that's within the power of the
illegal?
presidency?
That's within the power of the presidency.
That's interesting. That's a good question.
That was the big. So outside of all of the BS between whether he incited the riot or the political stuff, like that was the big the broader implication of why people had a problem with that rule.
So the idea, so like for example, if he were to, shoot people in the streets as president, right? If he were to like mow over a community, like if you were to kill a bunch of people, leveraging the power of the presidency, you're saying that according to how that ruling happened, he could not be prosecuted for any of that because he was acting within the power of the presidency?
He can't just go and start killing people.
Why not?
But if you were, so to my understanding, it's if you are doing something in the acting role of the president in executing the duties of your office.
So what if the duties of the office are there's a protest that's happening outside, and I think those are all terrorists. So we need to quench that. Use all force necessary, and all force necessary means that they all.
I guess the legal argument or the thing there would be is like, is that an overreach of power without any intelligence or process? It's like I guess that could be argued that he wasn't acting within the duties of the presidency, because the duties of the presidency would require one to ensure that the people who they're doing that are actually those people, not just you just did. Like I feel like that's getting into the nuance of in particular things, and I'm not saying that they can't be charged for something. I'm saying that, to my understanding, the ruling has just created such a broad swath of what can be considered acting in the capacity of the president,
right?
That provides that immunity.
Interesting.
So
I'd have to look at that a little more because I don't.
I feel like I want to read. I never read the
actual ruling.
Yeah, what is it called? So you got the dissenting, and then but you got whenever they make the ruling, whoever writes I forget what it's called, but they write the ruling and the reason as to why. I think that not all judges, but you've got the one who writes it for everybody, and then some of the other judges will write components. Yeah. Like all three of the left judges, if you will, wrote dissenting remarks to the ruling that happened on Friday. I don't think anybody other than Amy Coney Barrett wrote anything to the affirmative of the ruling. And I don't think that typically
it's either just the ruling and then dissenting opinions.
Yeah,
just typically.
Sometimes you'll have like even someone who ruled it. Sometimes you'll have, I think, some of the other judges on the court provide their own opinion to it, but there's always one judge will always write
a dissenting.
The affirmative, the whole thing
right.
It on behalf of the
whole court
as to the decision. Because it is the decision of all of the court,
right.
Even though there's dissenting remarks, the court in of itself, made that decision.
Interesting.
So
okay.
But yeah, I just think that's that's just some interesting stuff.
Yeah, and this, like, I guess to your point, like, there's so many different layers that you can get in, like, lost in. Mm-hmm. It's hard to have these conversations when you're not actively paying attention. Like, I feel like I actively pay attention, and I have a hard time keeping up.
Well, it's just so much.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say it's like, bait and switch, and I think the big one I was listening to something else. There was an act. I think that Reagan got rid of it. But it was an act or something that was pretty much that news outlets.
Oh, the Fairness Doctrine.
That's what it was. Yeah. So the news outlets got funded by the shows that were on the network as a public service.
Right.
And then I think it was Reagan who got rid of that. I think it was his administration that got rid of the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah. Well, the Fairness Doctrine also had there were rules.
Yeah.
And part of the rules were that you had to report
on both sides.
Not both sides, two sides. You had to report on like two perspectives. Of every story. You had to have at least two perspectives. Now, it didn't have to be.
And then if you're given an opinion, like it was clearly stated this is the opinion section of
correct. Like you had to be like all of those things were very clear, and then you had to say at least two sides of a story, and it didn't have to be like left right. It just needed to be like two opposing views, right? Exactly of a particular story, and so that all stories were showcased as being sort of a fair perspective on what's being reported.
Yeah,
but I mean, to Reagan's defense, that rule does go against the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech. So basically, by having that rule in place, it requires the news media to follow a certain format. While I'm a huge advocate of the First Amendment, I think that was probably one of the few things that I would say that, as much as I'm a huge advocate of the First Amendment, that's one of the few things that actually worked. It worked.
See, but
it was a valid argument. It is unconstitutional to do that. So that's the problem with it. It's a great idea and it works, but it is unconstitutional according to the way the First Amendment is written.
See, I don't know. I feel like when I hear the First Amendment, that's to protect the freedom of speech of an individual or of persons
and the news media
against the tyranny of the government
and the media.
Right. But but to have a requirement that you just tell two differing perspectives, I don't know.
You can't limit.
But even if you took that off, I think that the other thing that it did was that it allowed for, to my understanding, getting rid of that, or one of maybe the restrictions of the Fairness Act was how it was funded, how the news was funded. Mm-hmm. And when they got rid of that, and mind you, maybe I can get with you on. I can get with you on that because it's like, well, the government is the one who's opposing the restrictions, which is oxymoronic to the First Amendment, right? Even though they're not controlling what is being said, they're creating inhibitors around how you can say it.
Correct.
Right? I think that's the argument. Mm-hmm. But I think, to my understanding, too, something else that was either changed around that same time or was part of the Fairness Act that got removed was how it was funded. Like I said, it was, to my understanding, it was funded by, because it was a public service.
I don't know how much of that was by the time Reagan. I don't know if it was a public service by that time.
But they weren't allowed to get funded by
like ads
and stuff. It wasn't a profit center. The news media itself was not a profit center.
But I don't know if that was a function of what happened in governance, or if that was just a function of it wasn't seen as a profit center at the time. You know what I mean?
I have to look more. Like that was just one small thing that I.
Can you let me know Dan Feller is having an issue getting into your residential listing? He doesn't have the code.
2004.
2004.
Sorry about that.
All right.
Get my flash.
If our work gets in the way of our podcast.
So it was an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
It didn't get into any one specific piece of legislation.
That's okay.
Which is that I actually enjoyed it more because I feel like then when you start talking about one specific piece of legislation, you lose the overarching view of really, in my opinion, kind of like the strings. I feel like we were talking more about the strings, like the things that were the broader picture of stuff instead of talking about one, but how these things impact or like just the larger view. So I thought today's conversation was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole point, right? To have these conversations and really get our brains thinking about how to look at these things. So, anyways, hey, this was our conversation today. Appreciate you guys watching. My name's Gus.
I am Chris.
And this is the Anomaly Podcast. We appreciate you guys watching. If you like what you're hearing or you have any comments on anything that we said today, please make sure you comment below. If there's any topics that you want us to cover, please make sure you let us know by writing in the comments below. Please like, please share, and then I'll see you guys next time.
Peace.
Peace.